I remember that night so clearly, even though it feels like a lifetime ago. The old clock in the kitchen struck midnight, and its chime seemed to echo through the quiet house, like a reminder that time was moving whether I was ready or not. Mark kissed me goodnight, more out of habit than affection, and turned to face the wall. I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything we hadn't said between us. My chest felt tight, like if I didn't speak now, the silence would crush me. So I whispered his name, gently, hoping he'd hear the tenderness in it. He sighed, that heavy kind of sigh men give when they're bracing for a talk they don't want, and told me to leave it for tomorrow. But I couldn't. Tomorrow always slipped into another tomorrow. I told him what had been building inside me for years, the ache that only grew stronger as every calendar page turned. I said, maybe it was time we stopped waiting for a miracle and thought about adoption. I said, life didn't slow down for people like us, that children didn't wait until you were ready, and that if we didn't act now, when would we? When our hair was gray, when our bodies ached too much to run after a toddler, when our energy and patience were already worn down. My voice shook, but I kept talking because it felt like if I let it out, maybe he would finally hear the truth in me. Mark groaned, rolled onto his back, and looked at the ceiling like I was asking him to move mountains. He said he'd heard this from me 100 times, and that 100 times he'd told me no. He called it dangerous, a gamble, said you never know what you're inviting into your life when the child isn't your own. He talked about bad blood, about the things you couldn't see on the surface, about hidden problems waiting to show up. He spoke like love was a transaction, like opening our home to a child was the same as signing a risky contract. I stared at him in the dim light, wondering how the man I once believed would stand with me through anything had turned into someone so afraid of giving. And then he said it, almost casually, like it proved his point. Just look at my boss. His tone carried the kind of certainty that made my stomach clench, because I knew exactly who he meant and what he was about to say. It wasn't just theory anymore. It was a story he thought justified closing the door on the idea of ever being parents. And lying there in the darkness, with the sound of that old clock still echoing in my ears, I felt a coldness settle between us that words alone could no longer warm. Mark smirked in that cold way of his and said his boss would find flaws in an angel if you handed him one. Then his voice grew sharper, louder, like he wanted to drive the point into me so deep I couldn't ignore it. He explained that before the adoption, the agency had promised the boy was perfectly healthy, not a trace of genetic problems. He said the papers were clear, all signed, sealed, official. And yet not long after, the boy came down with something so ordinary, just a case of jaundice, the kind kids get all the time. But instead of recovering, it spiraled into a liver complication so serious that now the only thing that could save him was a transplant. I remember sitting up in bed, the air caught in my throat. I whispered, "That poor boy," and I meant it with every cell of my body. But Mark only shrugged, like compassion was some indulgence we couldn't afford. He told me his boss wasn't focused on saving the child at all. Instead, he'd already started looking for a lawyer, a real sharp one, to sue the orphanage for misleading him, and at the same time he was filing the paperwork to give the child back. Just like that, like he was returning a broken appliance to the store. I stared at him, stunned, my heart pounding as I tried to process what he had just said. I said, almost pleading, "But Jacob calls him Dad. How can a man walk away when a child looks at him with those eyes and calls him that word?" My voice cracked, and I felt myself leaning forward, like maybe if I moved closer, Mark would finally understand. He only sighed, heavy and tired, like I was the one being unreasonable. He reminded me once more that this was exactly why adoption was a mistake, why he would never say yes to it. He said you never really know who you're letting in, that it's someone else's blood, someone else's history, someone who will never truly be yours. He said it as though love could be measured in ownership, as though being a parent was nothing more than passing on your own DNA. I pulled my knees up under me and wrapped my arms around my head, trying to block out the way his words made me feel. The bed suddenly felt too wide, the silence too heavy, and all I could think of was that boy lying in some hospital bed, sick and alone, his body fighting for its life, while the man he called Dad searched for loopholes to get rid of him. My stomach twisted at the thought, and I kept hearing the echo of Mark's voice saying, "Nothing, there's nothing of yours in him." And I couldn't stop myself from whispering back, almost to no one, "But he's a child. Isn't that enough?" I couldn't sleep after what Mark told me. The picture of that boy haunted me, his small body fighting alone while grown men shuffled papers and made excuses. I asked Mark straight out if Jacob was still in the hospital, though deep down I already knew the answer. Where else would he be? A child that's sick wouldn't be anywhere but under fluorescent lights and machines keeping him alive. I told Mark I was going to see him, that he could do whatever he wanted, but I was not going to stand by while a child suffered. He scoffed, called me ridiculous, tried to brush me off the way he always did, but I turned my back to him and shut my eyes. It was the only way I could keep from screaming. The next morning, I took the train downtown to Massachusetts General, my heart hammering with every stop. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, the kind of smell that seeps into your clothes and lingers. I found the ICU and asked the nurse at the desk if I could see Jacob Miller. She looked me over, squinting like she was deciding if I was worth her time, then asked sharply who I was to him. And before I could think of a lie that made sense, the words slipped out. "I'm a potential donor." Her eyebrows shot up, and just like that, the suspicion in her face shifted into urgency. She handed me a gown, a mask, a cap, shoe covers, told me to suit up. My hands shook as I tied the strings behind my back. She led me into a room that was quiet except for the steady drip of an IV and the soft hiss of a monitor. And there he was. Jacob looked so small, almost swallowed by the bed, his skin tinted yellow, his lips pale and dry. The dark circles under his eyes made him look older than a child should ever look. For a second, my chest clenched so tight I thought I might collapse right there. He looked like a shadow of a boy, fragile and almost gone, and it scared me more than I could admit. Then his eyes opened, slow and heavy, and he saw me. And somehow, against all the weakness in his body, he smiled, the faintest, most heartbreaking smile. His little voice came out soft, tired, but clear enough to pierce me. "I thought nobody was coming." That was all he managed before his eyelids sank again, too heavy to hold up. I pressed my hand against my mouth, biting back the sob that threatened to break me open, and in that moment, something shifted inside me. Whatever fear or hesitation I had about what this might cost me, my health, my marriage, my future, it didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was that boy breathing in that bed. The nurse didn't soften when she looked at me. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that cut through excuses, and she motioned for me to step back out into the hall. She asked if I'd done my blood work yet, and for a moment I froze, realizing I'd just called myself a donor without even thinking what that meant. I stumbled over my words, saying no, not yet, that I hadn't had time because of work, and besides, the labs were closed on Sunday. I lowered my head like a child caught in a lie, embarrassed at how unprepared I sounded. She leaned closer, her voice low but firm, reminding me that every minute mattered, that without a donor, Jacob's body was drowning in its own toxins. Then she added, almost under her breath, "I don't know what his father is thinking." I tried to defend Mr. Harrison, almost out of reflex, saying there were complicated circumstances, but she waved her hand as if brushing my words aside. "I've seen plenty of those complicated situations," she muttered. "They always have money for their girlfriends, but never for their children's treatments." The word girlfriends stopped me cold. I repeated it, stunned, because I couldn't picture Mr. Harrison, that cold, joyless man with his stiff suits and narrowed eyes, in the role of some womanizer. I'd only ever seen him scowling at staff meetings or barking orders down the phone. The thought wouldn't leave me. I started wondering if his perfectly composed wife, Catherine, with her calm voice and flawless hair, was simply playing a part, standing beside him like a porcelain statue, while the truth of their life was something far uglier. Was their whole adoption of Jacob just another performance, a way to look generous in front of their friends or polish their image in the community. Was this child nothing but a prop in their carefully staged play? My stomach tightened at the possibility, the picture of Jacob's small yellowed face flashing in my mind. The nurse must have seen something cross my face because she leaned even closer, her voice carrying a mix of bitterness and warning. "What did you expect? Don't go fooling yourself thinking your husband's any better. Check up on him. Watch carefully. You'll see what he's really made of." The way she said it, almost with a cruel sort of satisfaction, left me shaken. I wanted to argue, to insist that Mark wasn't that kind of man, but her words stuck to me like burrs. I carried them with me as I walked out of that hallway, and deep down, though I tried not to admit it, a part of me wondered if she was right. The nurse had pointed me toward the attending doctor that night, and though my nerves were raw, I forced myself to speak with him, to ask the questions no one else seemed willing to. By the next day, I had rolled up my sleeves and gone through the testing myself. Blood drawn into vials, while the technician made small talk I barely heard. I was exhausted by the time I got home, but the weight of what I'd learned pressed so hard on me that I couldn't hold it in. That evening, while Mark sat at the kitchen table scrolling on his phone, I told him there was something he needed to hear. My heart pounded in my chest as I said it, because to me, it felt like hope. I told him my blood type matched Jacob's exactly, rare and difficult to find. To me, it felt like fate reaching down and tapping me on the shoulder, saying, "Here, you can save this boy." But Mark barely looked up, his first reaction not joy, not relief, but disappointment, like I'd handed him a burden instead of a gift. "And who exactly is this supposed to be lucky for?" he asked, smirking. I stared at him, stunned that he couldn't see it. I said, "For Jacob, for the child who's lying in a hospital bed fighting for his life. I can be the donor he's been waiting for." For a moment he was quiet, almost calculating, and then his whole face lit up in a way that made my stomach sink. He leaned forward, his voice full of excitement, but not the kind I'd hoped for. "Susan, don't you see? If I tell Harrison I've found a donor for his son, he'll owe me big. He might even push me for that promotion I've been chasing." He laughed like he'd just solved a puzzle, clapping his hands together, already imagining the corner office. He pulled me close, kissing me with an enthusiasm that felt hollow, while all I could think about was the little boy in that bed and how far apart Mark and I were in the way we measured happiness. Still, I pressed on, because I couldn't afford to let his selfishness cloud the bigger picture. The next day I started gathering the documents, signing forms, and walking through endless hospital corridors that smelled of bleach and despair. I wasn't afraid of the surgery, not anymore. The doctors had explained that only a portion of my liver would be taken, that it would regenerate in time. I held on to that thought like a lifeline, that I could heal, that Jacob could heal, and that maybe, just maybe, this act would tie us together in a way that felt like family. I told myself it didn't matter that he wasn't mine by blood. After all, what made us human wasn't ownership, it was love, and love was the only thing I had left to give. What broke me more than anything was realizing Mr. Harrison wasn't rushing to save his son at all. While doctors waited for his consent, he was moving faster with lawyers, drafting paperwork to give Jacob back to the system, filing complaints against the foster agency like the child was a defective product he'd been tricked into taking. His wife, Catherine, kept her usual calm, the kind of practiced neutrality that looked graceful at dinner parties, but felt like cruelty in a hospital hallway. She didn't raise her voice, didn't fight for the boy, didn't fight for anything, really. She just smiled her soft, empty smile and drifted in and out like she wasn't part of the story at all. Sometimes, she would bring Jacob little trinkets, small toys, or snacks, and he would accept them politely, his thin fingers curling around the gift. He always said, "Thank you, Mom," in that way children do when they still believe love can be earned. But the second she walked out of the room, he'd hand the toy to a nurse and ask her to tuck it away in the nightstand, almost as if he couldn't bear to look at it once she was gone. Watching that nearly shattered me, because it wasn't just his body that was fighting. It was his heart, too. My own test results came back, and every single marker confirmed what I already felt in my bones. I was a perfect match. The doctors told me the only thing left was to wait for the final clearance from the lab that tested for hepatitis. Waiting felt unbearable. Jacob didn't have weeks to spare, and every time I visited, I could see his color fading, his strength thinning. I kept asking the staff if there was any way to hurry it along, and one of the ICU nurses finally whispered that sometimes the lab had results ready, but no one to deliver the paperwork. "If you can get down there yourself, you might cut days off the wait," she said, her eyes darting like she was passing me a secret. So that's what I did. The very next morning, I grabbed my bag and caught the subway across town to the research center. The whole ride, I kept thinking how absurd it was that a boy's life depended on paper stamps and signatures, when in our world, everything else traveled by email in seconds. But that was the system, and I was ready to play by its rules if it meant saving him. As the train rattled under the city, my stomach twisted with a mix of hope and dread. I told myself that once I had those papers in my hands, there would be no more excuses, no more delays, no more hiding behind bureaucracy. It would be real, and Jacob would finally have a chance. The doctor had explained to me that electronic files weren't enough, that the system still demanded official papers stamped in ink, tucked neatly into folders that inspectors could flip through. I remember muttering under my breath about how some things never changed, how bureaucracy could still hold a child's life hostage. By the time the bus dropped me off, I was already tense, staring up at the research center, an old stone building that looked more like a mansion from another century than a medical institute. The high fence, the heavy gate, the guard at the booth, it all felt imposing, like I was stepping into a world designed to keep ordinary people out. I walked toward the gate, clutching my ID, rehearsing what I'd say to the guard, when something in the courtyard caught my eye. For a second, my brain refused to process it, because it seemed so out of place. There, strolling across the grounds with a spring in his step, was Mark, my Mark, and he wasn't alone. A young woman clung to his arm, her laughter light and unguarded, his face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. He leaned down to kiss her, playful, easy, the kind of kiss that used to belong to me. Why, my throat tightened so fast I almost coughed. I pressed myself against the cold wall of the bus stop, hiding like a child in a game of pretend, my hands trembling. I watched as he held the gate for her, waved at the guard like he owned the place, then wrapped his arm around her waist with a tenderness he hadn't offered me in a long time. She teased him, saying something I couldn't catch, and he answered in that same low voice he once saved for me. When she hesitated about going to his place, worried about being discovered, he laughed and kissed her forehead the way he used to when he wanted me to forget a fight. Then I heard her say they should go to their favorite restaurant first, and my stomach lurched. Their favorite. They had a routine, a history, something that belonged to them, while I was still convincing myself my marriage was salvageable. He called a cab, holding her close as if they were newlyweds, and they stood there waiting with the ease of two people who had nothing to hide. I stayed frozen behind that wall, barely daring to breathe, every nerve in my body on fire. The betrayal wasn't just in what I saw, but in how natural it all seemed, like he'd been living this other life far longer than I'd allowed myself to imagine. There was a part of me that wanted to storm out from behind that wall, to scream at Mark and the girl, to claw the truth right out into the daylight. But I knew myself well enough to fear what I might do if I let go. The anger burned too hot, and I was terrified it would turn into something I couldn't take back. So I stayed hidden, biting down on my own tongue until they were gone. When their cab finally pulled away, I stepped out, my legs weak, and collapsed onto a bench by the gate. The tears came fast, the kind you can't hold back no matter how hard you try. My chest heaved, and I pressed my fists to my eyes like maybe I could block the whole world out. A gruff voice startled me. "Ma'am, are you okay?" It was the guard, leaning halfway out of his booth, concern mixed with impatience. He asked if I was coming inside, reminding me the offices would be closing soon. I wanted to say no, to run home, crawl under the covers, and disappear from the wreckage of my life. But then Jacob's face flashed in my mind, those thin hands gripping the blanket, those yellowed eyes still managing to search for kindness. I couldn't abandon him, not after promising him silently that he wasn't alone. So I stood, wiped my face with the back of my hand, and forced myself through the gate. Later, back at the house, I didn't know how to breathe around Mark. He went about his evening as if nothing had happened, humming while he showered, scrolling his phone while I sat frozen at the kitchen table. I've never been good at screaming matches, never liked drama, and in that moment the idea of confronting him felt impossible. What I wanted most was to vanish, to pack a bag and slip back to my hometown, let him wake up one day to an empty bed and no explanation. But Jacob held me there. That boy needed me, and I had already given him a promise that was stronger than the vows my husband had broken. So I called the doctor. My words tumbled out in a rush, shaky and desperate, but he listened and told me I was already cleared for surgery, just missing the official referral. He said he'd bring it himself, meet me at the hospital, and we'd get it done the proper way. That night, I was admitted, alone in a small hospital room, the sheets stiff and scratchy, my body restless, but my heart strangely steady. Tomorrow I would see Jacob again, hold his hand, maybe even make him smile, and soon I would give him the piece of myself he needed to live. I told myself that once the surgery was done, once he was safe, then I'd decide what to do about Mark. Until then, there was only one mission: save that boy. I rushed back to the ICU early the next morning, pulling on the gown, the shoe covers, the cap, my hands trembling with anticipation. All I wanted was to see Jacob, to reassure him, to tell him I was still there. But when I pushed the heavy door open, my breath caught in my throat. The bed where he had been lying was empty of him, and instead a grown man was stretched out under the wires and monitors, his face shadowed with days of stubble. Beside him sat an older gentleman in a crisp suit and gold-rimmed glasses, filling out papers with the slow precision of someone who had been doing it his whole life. He looked like a character pulled straight from another era, calm and detached, until he noticed me standing there. "Who are you here for?" he asked politely, adjusting his glasses. I stammered, explaining I was looking for the child who had been in that bed. He shook his head slightly, but before he could say more, the man in the bed stirred, his voice raspy, scraping out words that made my whole body freeze. He told the older man, whom he called Mr. Rosenfeld, that he already knew who deserved everything he had, and then his eyes slid to me. "Her," he whispered. My stomach lurched. I stepped closer, confused, and that's when I saw them, his eyes. Eyes I had memorized a lifetime ago. Eyes that had once laughed with me in high school hallways and made promises under bleachers we were too young to keep. My knees nearly gave way. "David?" I breathed, my voice breaking. He smiled faintly, through the exhaustion, through the illness, and said he knew I'd recognize him eventually, though he thought the sickness had changed his face too much. I covered my mouth, stunned, staring at the man who had been my first love, my wildest mistake, the one I had never really let go of. He tried to joke, saying what else could he do but face dying with a crooked smile, with music in his head, and even then the pain made him wince. Mr. Rosenfeld cleared his throat, sat up straighter, and looked between us with an expression that carried both curiosity and recognition. In that sterile hospital room, with the machines humming and the morning sun fighting through the blinds, it felt like the past had come crashing into the present, like life was pulling me into a story I thought had ended decades ago. My heart pounded so hard I couldn't tell if it was grief, disbelief, or something terrifyingly close to hope. Mr. Rosenfeld cleared his throat and looked at us over the top of his glasses, his voice dry but curious. "So, if I'm hearing this right, you two already know each other." David let out a weak laugh and said yes, since high school, though life had gotten in the way before either of us had the courage to make it real. He reminded me that I had left for college in the city and never looked back, and I lowered my eyes, shame washing over me. I whispered that I'd heard stories too, that he hadn't thought of me, that he'd married someone else, and that's why I built a different life. I told him I was Susan Johnson now, and saying it out loud felt both true and hollow at the same time. Mr. Rosenfeld sighed, shaking his head the way older men do when they've seen too many love stories collapse under the weight of time. Young people, he muttered, always rushing, always certain, and then they let happiness slip through their fingers. He shuffled his papers, then asked David straight out if he wanted his will drawn up in my name. The words made my heart stutter, and before I could respond, David's face twisted at the mention of his wife. The bitterness in his expression said more than words ever could. He told us his wife was only that on paper, that for months she hadn't even shared a bed with him, always inventing excuses, always absent. He spoke with a tired disgust, saying she'd been caught in one shady business deal after another, her lies stacking up so high he no longer tried to defend her. With a wife like that, he rasped, you don't need enemies. Then he glanced at me, his eyes softer, and gave me a half smile, the kind that carried both mischief and pain. It was the same look he used to give me in the back row of class when we shared secrets no one else knew. Then he said the words that left me stunned. Don't worry, Susan, you'll inherit everything, and you'll be the one running this place. I blinked, not understanding, until he explained that he'd built a chain of cosmetic clinics, that he'd gone from fixing broken noses in our small hometown to owning a network of practices in the city. He said it with pride, but also with a heaviness, like he knew it could all be gone in an instant. And as I stood there, listening, I realized the boy I'd once loved had become a man who had lived, built, and bled for something real. And now, somehow, he was handing it back into my life. David told me he had built his own clinic years ago, and now it had grown into an entire network spread across the city. I felt the tears sting in my eyes as I shook my head. David, I don't know the first thing about running a business like that, I whispered, my throat tight. Why would you even think of leaving it to me? He gave a tired grin, his eyes closing for a moment, as a wave of pain crossed his face. That's the easy part, he said softly. I already have a strong team. You'd only need to trust them, lean on the manager, let him show you the ropes. You wouldn't be alone. The thought made me ache. He was still so young, still strong in so many ways, and here he was talking about me taking over his life's work. Why are you saying this? I asked, the words trembling out of me. You can't just give up. Not like this. You should be fighting, demanding answers, looking for treatments. You can't just let go. I wanted to grab his hand, to shake him back into the boy I remembered, the one who laughed at life like it couldn't touch him. He shrugged weakly, his voice low but steady. The doctors had mentioned heart failure, decompensated, he said, though they admitted the situation had unraveled too quickly to be certain. It didn't sound final when he explained it, more like a mystery waiting to be solved, but the heaviness in his tone said he'd already resigned himself. I leaned closer, insisting, almost begging, that this wasn't how it worked. Bodies don't just collapse overnight, I told him. Something's wrong here, and you know it. But he only looked at me with those sad eyes, as if I was still the dreamer, and he was the one already standing at the edge. Mr. Rosenfeld cleared his throat, breaking the silence, and slid a document across the tray table for David to check. He read it quickly and nodded, his hand trembling as he signed. My chest tightened at the sight, like the paper itself was stealing him away from me. My eyes darted back to the empty space where Jacob's bed had been, and panic fluttered in my stomach. David, I need to go find him, I blurted, torn between two worlds pulling at me at once. He gave me a crooked smile, the kind that still carried warmth even in the shadow of death. Go on then, he murmured. You've always had a way of slipping through my fingers. His words followed me out of the room, and for a moment I couldn't tell if they were heavy with sorrow or laced with hope. Before I left David's room, he warned me that if the doctors managed to stabilize him, they'd move him upstairs to intensive care, and he might not be there when I came back. I nodded, but my mind was already racing in another direction. If that was true for him, then maybe Jacob had been moved too. The thought sparked a fragile hope in me. Maybe he wasn't gone. Maybe his small body had held on through the night. I hurried down the hall and found a doctor willing to point me to the right place. When I stepped into the new ward, there he was, Jacob, tucked into clean sheets, the monitors still steady but his face brighter than before. I leaned over him and whispered, "Hey there, sweetheart." He looked up at me, weary but alert, and gave the smallest nod. I told him I was staying in the hospital now, just down the hall, and that for the whole week I'd be close enough to visit every day. His face lit up in a way that made the sterile room feel warm. "Really?" he asked, his voice soft but eager. "Yes, really," I told him, and when he asked if I'd read to him, my chest ached with both joy and sorrow. I promised we'd finish The Wizard of Oz together, and that I had plenty of other stories waiting after that. He clapped his thin hands together once, almost shyly, and I sat in the chair beside his bed, suddenly aware of how natural it felt to be there. For the first time in days, I wasn't thinking about Mark at all. The sting of his betrayal dulled, replaced by the quiet clarity that some people no longer deserved space in my heart. The next morning I returned, carrying a book and some small treats, determined to keep my promise. Jacob smiled when he saw me, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. Later, I peeked back into the ICU, but David's bed was empty. Panic fluttered until a nurse told me he'd been moved up to cardiology. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my heart racing with a mix of dread and hope. And when I turned the corner and saw him sitting upright, looking far stronger than the night before, my breath caught. For a moment, I didn't trust my own eyes. When I walked into the cardiology floor, I almost didn't recognize him. David was sitting upright near the nurse's station, color back in his face, waving at me like we were old friends meeting for coffee. "Susan," he called, cheerful and alive in a way that left me stunned. I stopped in my tracks, blurting out that yesterday he'd looked like death itself. He chuckled and leaned in close, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. He told me he had asked the doctors to inform his wife that he was in critical condition, that she shouldn't bother visiting, only start preparing for the funeral. My jaw dropped, and then he added, almost amused, that she had wasted no time, had already picked out a gravesite, already made arrangements. "She's going to be shocked," he said with a wry grin, "when she sees me standing upright, instead of lying under the dirt." I couldn't wrap my head around it. How could this game of pretending to be at death's door have anything to do with his sudden improvement? But David explained, watching me carefully. His wife had stopped visiting, stopped bringing him treats from home, as she called them, and without those meals, his blood work had shifted almost overnight. The strange toxins that had been stressing his heart were gone, and the lab had confirmed it. She had been slowly poisoning him, or at least weakening him, right under everyone's nose. My hands went cold as the truth sank in. "David," I whispered, my voice breaking, "she was trying to kill you?" He didn't flinch, only grew serious, the humor draining from his face. I asked him why any woman would do that to her husband, and his answer cut me to the bone. He told me they'd only been married a little over a year, that his first wife had died in childbirth, along with their baby, leaving him hollow for so long he thought he'd never love again. And when Tiffany came along, young and vibrant, he mistook her attention for salvation. But she hadn't married him for love. She had married him for money. Hearing him say it out loud was like watching a mirror shatter. Pieces of the life he thought he had falling in every direction. He spoke quietly, admitting that all her charm had been an act, that every sweet word was nothing more than strategy. "She didn't love me," he said, his eyes narrowing with a grief that was sharper than anger. "She loved the idea of what I could give her." I stood there frozen, remembering the way Mark had smiled at that other woman just a day before, and I realized with a jolt how quickly marriages can rot when they're built on selfishness instead of truth. David shook his head, almost laughing at himself, saying he should have known better, that a man his age had no business believing a girl fresh out of college could love him for anything but his money. There was no bitterness in his tone, just a tired acceptance, and it broke my heart to see him carry it so quietly. I let out a long sigh, and before I knew it, the words spilled out. I told him Mark had done the same to me, traded me in for someone younger, brighter, someone who hadn't yet carried the weight of years together. I confessed I'd caught them myself, hand in hand, kissing like the world was theirs. And instead of confronting him, I'd packed a bag and checked into the hospital, determined to do something meaningful, something selfless. I told David about Jacob, about the boy's fragile frame, and the way his eyes still lit up when I promised to read him stories. I said I was preparing to be his donor, that the surgery scared me less than the thought of leaving him alone in that hospital bed. David's eyebrows lifted, and for the first time since I'd seen him, a spark of admiration cut through his weariness. "You're brave," he murmured, shaking his head in quiet wonder. "You're willing to risk your own body for a child who isn't even yours." His words should have frightened me, but instead they steadied me. I smiled and said that for a child like Jacob, nothing I gave could ever be wasted. Then I added something I hadn't expected to feel: relief. I told David I was glad I didn't have to fight over his messy inheritance, that his life was already tangled enough without me in it. He laughed, a real laugh this time, and said, "What makes you think you're getting out of it? I'm not immortal, Susan. One day, this all has to go to someone, and who better than you?" My mouth fell open, shocked, but his eyes twinkled like he was enjoying my confusion. Mr. Rosenfeld, who had been quietly shuffling his papers, glanced up with the faintest smile, as if he too already knew where this was headed. I shook my head, insisting he was talking nonsense, that once I got through this surgery, I was going to leave Mark for good, and finally cut myself free from a marriage that had become nothing but chains. And David looked at me with a softness I hadn't felt in years, the kind that wrapped around me like a blanket. "Then let's both fix our mistakes," he said gently. I frowned, not sure what he meant, until he added with that familiar crooked grin, "When you're out of here, I'll marry you, this time for real." The words made my breath catch, because for the first time in so long, I felt the ground shift beneath me towards something that looked like hope. A month later, I walked out of that hospital not only healed, but with Jacob's small hand tucked into mine. He had survived, stronger than the doctors expected, his cheeks filling out with color again, his laughter returning in shy bursts that melted everyone around him. Mark's boss had signed the papers to relinquish him long before the transplant was even complete, and when the approval went through, it was as if Jacob had never existed to that family. But to me, he was everything. With David by my side, I filed the adoption papers, proving to the state that I wasn't just a woman alone anymore, but soon to be the wife of a man with stability, resources, and the kind of heart that wanted Jacob as much as I did. For the first time in my life, the word family felt real. My divorce from Mark was finalized while I was still in rehab, my body aching, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. He tried to claw back my attention, waving his arms, swearing it was all a misunderstanding, that the young woman I'd seen him with was just a colleague, just business. But those words rang as empty as every other promise he had broken. Lies can only stretch so far before they collapse under their own weight. And just as David's wife had been exposed for slipping him medication that made him sicker instead of better, the truth about Mark stood naked in front of me. He was never going to love anyone more than himself. The police soon turned their attention to Tiffany, uncovering one scheme after another, until she no longer had time to pose as a wife. As for Mark, the fantasy crumbled. His girlfriend, who had been so eager when she thought his promotion was coming, had no interest in living on the salary of a mid-level employee. She walked away without looking back, and he was left scrambling for work, stripped of the career and the image he had clung to. Meanwhile, David and I were making plans not for endings, but for beginnings. We chose to marry back in Springfield, my hometown, where my parents still lived, and where half our classmates could fill the pews and the reception hall with the kind of laughter we had missed for decades. When I walked down that aisle, Jacob was the ring bearer, his grin wide, his little suit slightly too big but perfect in every way. The music swelled, people cheered, and for the first time in so long, joy didn't feel like a dream. It felt solid, alive, ours, because that's how families are born. Not out of perfection, not out of blood, but out of choices made in love, even after betrayal, even after pain. And if this story touched you the way it still touches me every time I tell it, I'd love for you to let me know. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part stayed with you the most, or if you've ever faced something that changed your life in ways you never expected. Don't forget to hit that like button so more women like us can find this story, and if you want to hear more chapters of my journey, make sure you subscribe. Your support really does mean the world to me. It's what keeps me going, and it's what makes sharing all of this worth it.